The night air around the rooftop hotel felt warm and calm. Yet something strange hung in the atmosphere. Something that made every small sound feel louder than usual, and every sudden movement feel sharper than normal. And this quiet tension grew even stronger when the guests noticed a young waitress named Lena walking across the poolside area with a tray balanced in her shaking hands. Because everyone could see she was nervous, and everyone could also see why she was trying so hard to stay invisible. Since a group of rich party girls had been whispering and laughing at her from the moment she arrived, Lena kept her head low as she stepped around the glowing blue water of the pool, wishing she could finish her shift quickly and go home to her sick mother, wishing she could avoid attention just for one night, because attention always brought trouble in places like this, and trouble always found her when powerful people were bored and looking for someone weaker to mock. Yet she kept moving with quiet strength, hoping the girls would stop staring at her soon. But the girls were not done, and the leader of the group, Victoria Halle, the mayor's daughter, lifted her glass and gave Lena a smirk that looked cold enough to freeze the entire rooftop. And she whispered loudly so the whole crowd could hear her, calling Lena slow, clumsy, and unfit for such an expensive event. And her friends laughed even louder, pushing one another as if Lena existed only for their entertainment. And Lena felt her face heat up. But she forced a small, polite smile, hoping it would calm them down. Near the far side of the pool, a man in a dark suit stood quietly with his hands behind his back, watching everything with calm yet intense eyes. And while nobody else took him seriously, he saw every cruel gesture happening in front of him. And this man was Daniel Cross, a millionaire known for avoiding parties like this. But tonight he attended for reasons only he understood, reasons he had not shared with anyone. And when he saw the way Lena was treated, something shifted in his expression, something sharp, something protective. The music changed and more guests gathered around Victoria's group, cheering and laughing as if the night was getting better. And Victoria stepped closer to Lena with a cruel smile, blocking her path on purpose, a silent challenge in her eyes. And Lena tried to step back, but Victoria moved again, following her like a cat chasing a cornered mouse. And Lena whispered that she needed to deliver the drinks, but Victoria only laughed and pushed the tray away, sending glasses crashing and sparkling across the floor like broken stars scattered near the glowing water. The sound made everyone stop for a second, and then laughter erupted again, loud enough to drown out Lena's tiny gasp, and she bent down to pick up the broken pieces. But Victoria nudged her shoulder sharply, making her lose balance for a moment. And Lena froze, afraid to move because she was standing inches from the edge of the pool, with the water glowing behind her like a trap waiting for her to fall into it. And Victoria leaned in closer with a smirk that held no kindness at all. Daniel watched with an expression that grew colder by the second, his jaw tightening, his eyes following every small movement, almost as if he could sense what would happen next before anyone else. Yet he stayed still for a moment, giving Victoria one last silent chance to walk away and act like a decent human being. But she ignored that invisible warning, because she did not know who Daniel was, and because she thought nobody in this place would ever dare stop her. Then it happened faster than Lena could react, faster than the guests could understand, because Victoria placed her hand on Lena's shoulder and gave her a sudden hard shove, and Lena gasped as her feet slipped on the wet tiles, her arms flailing as she tried desperately to grab anything. But there was nothing to hold, and the next moment her body fell backward into the cold, glowing water, crashing down with a splash so loud that it sliced through the music and made the entire rooftop fall silent for the first time that night. For a long second, nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody even blinked, because it was so shocking, so sudden. And the sight of Lena surfacing with fear and confusion in her eyes made the party feel different, darker, heavier, and even Victoria froze for a moment, as she realized the crowd was no longer laughing with her, only staring in stunned silence, as if they suddenly saw her for what she truly was, instead of who she pretended to be. Then a single figure finally stepped forward, Slow but steady, each step sounding louder than the music, louder than the dripping. Water coming from Lena's hair as she tried to swim toward the side. And Daniel Cross reached the edge of the pool just as Lena struggled to lift herself out, and he extended his hand toward her with calm confidence, helping her rise onto her feet, and the entire crowd watched in confusion because they had no idea why this quiet man acted with such authority. Daniel turned toward Victoria, his eyes unblinking, his voice calm yet sharp as steel, and he asked one simple question that sliced through the air like a blade. The kind of question that made everyone freeze again. His voice carried across the rooftop, cold and steady, leaving the whole crowd trembling with curiosity and fear. Who pushed her? The rooftop stayed silent after Daniel asked his question, and every guest looked around with wide eyes as if waiting for someone else to speak first because nobody wanted to be the one caught lying, and nobody wanted to face the anger that hid behind Daniel's calm voice, which sounded gentle, but carried a strange weight that made people stand straighter and breathe slower, as if they were suddenly aware that something important had just changed in the air. Victoria forced a laugh that sounded shaky like glass, ready to crack, and she flipped her wet hair over her shoulder, even though she had not touched the water, and she said Lena only slipped and that everyone saw it, and there was nothing to worry about. But her smile trembled at the edges, because she could see something in Daniel's eyes that made her nervous, something she was not used to feeling, since she believed nobody in this city would ever dare question her or challenge her. Lena stood beside Daniel, shivering from the cold water dripping down her clothes, and she stared at the ground because she did not want to look at Victoria or the crowd, and she whispered that she did not want trouble, and she could finish her shift and leave quietly, and she tried to step back, but Daniel gently held her arm, telling her in a steady voice that she did not deserve what happened and that she should not blame herself for being hurt by cruel people. Guests whispered among themselves, creating a soft ripple of fear and curiosity across the rooftop, and some people began to record with their phones, while others stepped away from Victoria as if her cruelty might stain their expensive clothes. And one girl from Victoria's own group tried to speak up, but Victoria shot her a look so sharp that the words died in her throat, and she stared at the floor instead. Daniel took a slow step forward, and every step he made sounded louder than the louder music which had faded into the background, as if even the speakers were waiting to hear what he would say next. And Daniel called Victoria by her full name in a calm voice, and the way he said it made her flinch, because only someone with real power spoke like that, and she finally realized this man was not ordinary and not someone she could mock or threaten the way she did with others. Victoria asked who he thought he was, and Daniel only raised a hand, and a suited man from the shadows approached, carrying a dark leather folder, and the crowd gasped softly, because nobody had seen that man earlier, and they wondered how long he had been watching, and why he stepped forward only when Daniel signaled him. And Victoria felt her stomach twist, because something about this moment felt wrong to her, and she knew she might be in danger. Daniel opened the folder slowly, and even this small action made the guests lean in closer with wide eyes and held breaths, and he asked Victoria one more time who pushed Lena, and this time his voice carried more weight and more force, and Victoria tried to lie again, but her voice broke halfway through her words, and Daniel looked unimpressed as he pulled a few papers from the folder and held them where she could see them. Lena watched carefully, feeling confused and unsure why Daniel had a folder, or why he seemed to know more about Victoria than anyone else at the party, and part of her wanted to run away from all the attention, but another part of her wanted to stay because something inside told her Daniel was doing this for a reason that somehow involved her, even though she did not understand how. Victoria demanded to know what was in the papers, and Daniel told her they were reports from previous events where staff had complained about a certain guest bullying them and causing injuries and threatening their jobs. And Victoria's face went pale as guests began murmuring around her, and one person even stepped back like they did not want to be seen near her anymore. Daniel handed the papers to Lena, and asked her to read them if she wanted to understand the kind of person who had pushed her, and Lena held the pages in trembling hands, reading slowly the simple sentences, written by frightened workers from past events, describing how Victoria had insulted them, tripped them, forced them to do impossible tasks, and then blamed them when anything went wrong, and each word felt heavier on her heart. Victoria tried to blame the staff and claimed they were jealous or paid to lie, but Daniel shook his head slightly and called another person forward, a young man in a server uniform from another event, who stepped into the light with nervous eyes, and he said in a soft voice that Victoria pushed him once too and forced him to keep quiet by threatening to get him fired, and the crowd gasped again because this was no longer gossip, but something real and painful. Lena looked at Daniel with wide eyes, realizing he had brought witnesses and evidence because he already suspected Victoria would hurt someone tonight, and she asked him quietly why he had known something like this might happen. And Daniel met her gaze with calm, steady eyes and told her he had been watching Victoria's behavior for months because he could not stand the way she hurt people who could not defend themselves. The rooftop fell into deeper silence as everyone waited for what would happen next, and Victoria stepped back, shaking her head and insisting none of it was true, while her hands trembled and her voice cracked and the fear in her eyes grew more obvious even under the glowing rooftop lights, while Daniel remained still and silent, like someone who already knew the final answer and was simply waiting for her last attempt to deny it. And then Daniel said in a quiet voice that carried across the whole rooftop like a cold wind cutting through the warm night air, that there was only one thing left for Victoria to do, and everyone leaned forward, breathless with suspense, as he said she needed to tell the truth, because the truth would come out tonight, whether she wanted it or not. A cold gust of wind swept across the rooftop as every guest stared at Victoria, waiting to hear if she would answer Daniel or keep lying, and the tension felt so heavy that even the music seemed to hold its breath, as if the speakers themselves were afraid to make a sound at the wrong moment and break whatever was about to happen next. In this strange, unforgettable night, Victoria backed away from Daniel with shaky steps, and her eyes darted around the rooftop, searching for support from her friends. But none of them stepped forward, and none of them defended her, because they all knew what had really happened, and they feared the power in Daniel's calm voice and the quiet authority in his steady posture and the strange way he seemed to know every secret she tried to hide from the world. Lena stood close to Daniel, still trembling from the cold water dripping from her clothes, but she could feel something changing inside her as she watched Victoria shake, and she wondered how a girl with so much money and power could look so frightened under Daniel's calm stare, and she wondered even more why Daniel cared so much about protecting her, because nobody had ever done that for her before, not even once. The other guests whispered behind their hands, but none wanted to get close to Victoria, as if her lies and cruelty might spread like a stain on their perfect designer outfits. And Daniel raised his hand again, and the same suited man approached with another folder, this one sealed with a silver clip, and the crowd shifted nervously because they understood that Daniel was not finished and that he had much more to reveal tonight. Victoria shouted that he could not pull secret papers out of nowhere and accuse her of things she did not do, but her voice cracked and sounded thin like paper tearing in the wind, and Daniel simply nodded at the suited man, who placed the second folder on a nearby table under the warm rooftop lights, and everyone leaned in slightly, not daring to blink because they did not want to miss a single moment. Daniel opened the folder slowly, and inside were photos, videos, and written notes, and each image showed different events, different rooms, different parties, and in nearly every one of them, Victoria stood in the center with a proud smirk, while someone else around her looked frightened, embarrassed, or hurt, and these moments were captured by the cameras of people she never noticed or people she never cared about because she believed they were beneath her. Lena covered her mouth when she saw one photo of a young server crying behind a table after Victoria shoved him into a stack of plates, and another photo showed Victoria yelling at a chef while her friends laughed in the background. And Lena felt a heavy sadness because she realized she was not the first, and she would not have been the last if Daniel had not stepped in tonight. Victoria screamed that the photos were fake and edited, and that Daniel wanted to ruin her life, but Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply turned one of the photos around so she could see the timestamp and the small reflection of her own bracelet. The one she always wore, the one she flaunted in every picture, the one detail she could not deny. No matter how much she wanted to, Daniel then pointed to a small security badge clipped under his suit jacket, and the crowd gasped softly because the badge had the emblem of his company, a company known for its strict ethics and its work exposing people in powerful positions who abused others. And Victoria stumbled back because she finally understood who Daniel was and why he had been watching her for so long, and her voice died in her throat. Before she could form another line, Lena stared at Daniel with wide eyes, feeling as if she were looking at someone completely different now, because he was not just a quiet man in a suit or a random guest at the event. He was someone who protected people, someone who saw the truth even when others looked away, and she felt something warm in her chest like hope, something she had not felt in a long time. Daniel stepped closer to Victoria, and the guests moved aside as if creating a path for something important. And he said in a slow, calm voice that nobody here needed to fear the truth, and that Victoria had a chance to speak now before the situation grew worse and the rooftop grew even quieter than before, because everyone understood what he meant even without him raising his voice. Victoria looked at the crowd, at the cameras, at Daniel, at the photos, and then at Lena, who stood dripping wet but brave, and she saw for the first time how small she looked, how selfish she appeared, and how her friends were no longer shielding her, and something inside her snapped like a rope stretched too tight, and she screamed that none of this mattered because her father, the mayor, would protect her from everything. Daniel shook his head slowly and told her that her father knew about the investigation and had agreed to let the truth come out, and Victoria stopped breathing for a moment because she understood that she truly had nowhere to run, now nowhere to hide, no lies left to protect her, because everything she had done was finally catching up to her under the bright rooftop lights. The guests watched breathlessly as Daniel placed the last photo from the folder on the table, revealing the moment he had been waiting to uncover, and the rooftop fell into stunned silence once again as every eye turned to Victoria, who now stood shaking, trapped and unable to escape the truth, waiting to hear what Daniel would say next, and what final piece of evidence he had brought tonight to end the lies once and for all. A heavy silence fell over the rooftop as Daniel placed the final photo on the table, and every guest leaned forward with wide, nervous eyes, because something about the way he handled that picture made the air feel colder and heavier, and even Lena felt her breath shake as she waited to see what was coming next from this calm man who never raised his voice, yet somehow controlled the entire rooftop with nothing but quiet strength. Victoria stared at the photo without blinking, and her face shifted from anger to fear to confusion because she recognized the moment frozen on the glossy surface, and she knew exactly when and where it was taken, even though she wished she could forget it forever. And she whispered in a tiny voice that nobody else could hear that this could not be happening, and that Daniel had no right to bring that night back into her life. Picture showed a young waiter from a winter charity gala standing at the bottom of a wide staircase while Victoria towered above him with her hand raised as if ready to strike, and the waiter looked terrified in the photo, and behind him lay a shattered tray and broken glasses that sparkled on the floor like crushed ice under the lights, and everyone around the image seemed frozen in shock, as though time had paused in that cruel moment. Gasps rippled across the rooftop, and the guests whispered to each other with trembling voices because some of them had been at that gala, and they remembered hearing rumors about a staff accident and about someone getting hurt, but the details had never been clear, and now the truth lay in front of them, captured in a picture nobody could ignore and nobody could twist into a lie. Victoria tried to step back, but her heels scraped loudly on the fungi tile, and the sound made several people flinch as Daniel lifted his gaze and looked at her with calm, unwavering eyes, and he asked in his steady, voice if she remembered that night and the way the waiter had begged her not to report him because he needed the job to care for his little brother, and how she laughed and blamed him anyway, even though she had caused the accident. Victoria shook her head wildly and kept saying it was not true, that the staff always made mistakes and she only corrected them, and that the picture captured the moment wrong. But the suited man beside Daniel stepped forward holding a small video device, and the crowd reacted with shock, because everyone knew a video could not lie as easily as a single frozen photo, and whispers echoed like soft thunder across the pool. Daniel gave a small signal, and the man pressed play, and a quiet recording filled the rooftop, showing that same winter night with voices echoing softly through the speakers, and the guests watched Victoria shove the waiter's shoulder while calling him useless and clumsy, and they saw the tray fall because of her push, and they saw the waiter fall to his knees as she shouted in anger at him, and nobody watching could deny what they saw with their own eyes. Lena brought her hands to her mouth as she watched the scene, and her heart ached for the waiter in the video, because she understood the pain of being powerless against people who believed they could control everything, and her eyes filled with tears, not for herself, but for everyone Victoria had hurt before tonight, and for all the nights when staff had gone home crying because of her cruelty. Victoria screamed for the video to stop, and she lunged toward the device, but Daniel stepped between her and the screen with one calm movement, and the crowd gasped as he straightened his posture and told her in a low, steady tone that she had done enough damage, and that the truth no longer belonged to her alone, because too many people had been hurt for too long, and tonight the lies were finally ending under the bright rooftop lights. The girls who once followed Victoria like shadows stepped away from her, now their eyes wide with guilt and fear, because they had ignored the harm she caused, and laughed when they should have spoken up, and one of them whispered that she could no longer defend someone who hurt others, and another added that they always thought she would never be caught, and now they felt ashamed for helping her hide the truth. Victoria turned to her friends with disbelief in her eyes and begged them to speak for her, but they lowered their heads, unable to protect her any longer, and she shouted at them, calling them traitors, but her voice cracked under the weight of her fear and the loneliness that now wrapped around her like cold chains she could not break. Daniel looked at Lena and asked gently if she was all right, and Lena nodded, though her hands still trembled, and she asked in a small voice why he had gone through so much trouble to gather every piece of evidence and bring all of it here tonight, and Daniel answered with soft strength that people like Victoria relied on silence and fear, and sometimes the only way to stop them was to bring everything into the light where lies could no longer hide. The guests murmured in agreement, their faces full of regret for not noticing sooner, and for allowing cruelty to grow in places that should have been filled with kindness and respect. And Daniel turned back to Victoria, who looked smaller than ever, and he told her that the truth had spoken, and now she had only one choice left on this rooftop. The wind blew across the pool as everyone leaned forward, waiting breathlessly, and Daniel said she could either confess what she did or watch the video spread everywhere, because the world deserved to know who she truly was under her shining dresses and empty smiles. And the rooftop held its breath again as Victoria trembled near the edge of the truth, unable to run and unable to deny what had finally caught up to her tonight. Wind grew stronger across the rooftop as Victoria stood frozen near the edge of the truth, with her hands shaking and her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and every guest leaned in a little closer, because they could feel something important was about to happen, something that would decide everything for Victoria and for Lena and for the night that had already changed so many things. Daniel stood tall and calm in the center of the rooftop, with the soft glow of the pool reflecting against his dark suit, and his voice carried gently across the space as he reminded Victoria that she had one last chance to speak for herself before the truth spoke louder than she ever could. And the way he said it made every person feel the weight of his words like they were stones dropping into deep water. Victoria looked around wildly, her eyes darting from one guest to another, and she tried to find even a single face that might defend her, or rescue her from the pressure building around her like a closing cage, but every guest looked away or stepped back, or crossed their arms as if they no longer wanted anything to do with her, and the loneliness settled cold against her skin, like frost forming under the rooftop. Lights. Lena stood a few steps behind Daniel, her clothes still damp from the pool, and her body still trembling, but she watched Victoria, not with anger, but with something softer, something tired and painful, because she understood better than anyone how it felt to be pushed down and ignored and wounded. And now that the truth had been shown, she knew this moment was not only about punishment, but about what would come next and what kind of person Victoria chose to be. Now that her lies were collapsing, Victoria finally whispered that she did not want her life to be ruined. And she begged Daniel to stop the video from spreading, and she claimed she could change and be better, but her voice broke halfway through and tears ran down her cheeks, and the guests watched with mixed feelings because they had seen her cruelty for so long, and some felt sympathy while others felt she deserved this moment of fear. Daniel took a slow breath, and then he did something unexpected, something that made every person hold their breath, because instead of scolding Victoria or threatening her, he stepped slightly aside, and he turned toward Lena with calm, steady eyes, and he said that the decision did not belong to him alone, and that the person most hurt tonight should be the one to decide what happened next. And every head turned toward Lena at the same time with wide eyes and stunned silence. Lena froze as all eyes fell on her, and she felt her heart race in her chest like a bird trying to fly out of a cage, and she looked at Daniel confused, because she never imagined she would have a voice in anything, and she never imagined someone as powerful as Daniel would ask her to make a choice that could change another person's future, and she felt both frightened and honored at the same time. Victoria gasped and fell to her knees, begging Lena to forgive her and promising that she would never hurt anyone again, and she asked Lena to think of her family, her reputation, her future, but Lena could still hear Victoria's cruel laughter from earlier echoing in her ears, along with the harsh words, the spilled drinks, the push that sent her into the cold glowing water, and all the fear that had filled her chest that night. Daniel did not rush her, and he did not speak again. He simply watched her with calm respect, letting her take her time, letting her decide with her own heart and not with fear. And Lena slowly stepped closer to Victoria, who looked small and broken on the floor, and the guests whispered nervously because they did not know what Lena would choose. And the suspense hung heavy in the air. Lena took a long, shaky breath and spoke in a soft voice that somehow carried across the entire rooftop because everyone was listening so closely, and she said she did not want revenge, and she did not want Victoria's life destroyed, because hurting someone back would not make her feel better, and it would not heal what happened. She also said that she would not pretend it was nothing, because it was not nothing, and it hurt deeply. Victoria lifted her head slowly with red eyes and shaky lips, waiting for the rest of Lena's words, and Lena continued with more strength, saying that if Victoria truly wanted this night to change her, then she must prove it through action, not words, and she must apologize to every worker she had ever insulted, pushed, threatened, or hurt, and she must treat people with respect, regardless of their job or their clothes or their income. Guests murmured in agreement, and some nodded with relief because Lena's words felt fair and kind without being weak, and Victoria stared at her for a long moment before finally nodding with trembling hands and whispering that she would do it, and that she was sorry, and the apology sounded real, maybe the first real apology she had ever spoken in her life. Daniel watched Lena with admiration and quiet warmth because he had expected her to choose forgiveness, but he had not expected her to choose it with such strength and such wisdom, and he realized she was not just kind, she was brave, and she was capable of seeing the world with a heart much stronger than anyone had treated her. Rooftop relaxed a little as the tension shifted into something softer, something lighter, and the guests stepped back, giving Lena space while Victoria remained on her knees in silence, and Daniel stepped beside Lena and told her softly that the night was not done, yet because there was something she still deserved to know, and something he had been waiting to tell her for a very long time.